Now I'd like to introduce our program for today, Why Recycling and the Circular Economy Are an America First Strategy for Economic Development to Climate Action. And we'll be starting off with introductory remarks from all four of our panelists. And I'd like to start by introducing our first speaker, Jon Smieja, Director of Circularity and EPR for WAP Sustainability. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Dan, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining the call this morning. All right, I think I am sharing my screen. This won't take long. I already saw a couple familiar faces on the attendee list, so my time in West Michigan from a decade ago is alive and well, apparently. Hi, everybody. I'm Jon Smieja. I'm the Director of Circularity and EPR at WAP Sustainability. I am relatively new to this role. Some folks, if you do recognize my name, might recognize me from my recent role leading circularity at GreenBiz. Just a quick introduction to WAP. We are a full service sustainability consultancy of about 80 professionals now. We do work in basically everything that a corporate sustainability team would need or would do, from product transparency like life cycle assessments and environmental product declarations, material health work, and chemical transparency documents. We also do ESG support, reporting, certifications, and verification work. And then we have a managed services team that is like an in-house extension of sustainability teams. So basically everything a company would need to do in sustainability that they don't have the resources for, we can help with that. And we build all of that work through deep partnerships and, really understanding the role of the sustainability manager firsthand. All right, enough about WAP. One of the reasons we are here today is because last year, almost a year ago now, I wrote this article when I was still at GreenBiz following the election of November 2024. And I wrote the words at the top of this list after Donald Trump got, or after at the top of this slide after Donald Trump got reelected, because we'd been hearing a lot about the America First policy agenda during Donald Trump's run to the White House. And, I thought about it, and I thought about the circular economy, and I said, there might be an opportunity here. So I wrote this article a little bit to raise eyebrows and get people questioning, but a little bit to talk about how we might be able to move this work forward during these next 4 years. While America First and the circular economy aren't really well aligned on their face, and they have many important differences between these two missions, they do align in many important ways. And one thing I recognized last November is that things like tariff policies and isolationism, however you feel about them as a political and economic tactic, could be a strong argument to accelerate the transition to a circular economy. In other words, not only was this a sustainability goal that was not polarized politically at the time, but as the same way as things like climate change and ESG, but one that could actually find allies in this America First coalition. And there was a few different ways that I thought about this being a possibility. As I read through the America First policy documents, which I would not recommend to many people on this call if you don't have to. As I read through them, I noticed a strong push for an American manufacturing renaissance. This is very similar to what we talk about when we talk about the circular economy. It includes building out reverse logistics hubs, rebuilding domestic manufacturing and workforce development. Of course, we can't go back to the 20th century model of manufacturing, but we can rethink the way we build and rebuild things to stabilize the manufacturing sector in this country. This includes, things like battery recycling facilities, repair and refurbishment shops, and manufacturing facilities similar to some of the ones we already have out there, like Davies Office Furniture operates in New York that manufactures office furniture, which I know everyone in West Michigan is familiar with that industry. It also has the opportunity to strengthen local economies. At one time, not so long ago, small towns and cities were dotted with repair shops, resale stores, and other businesses that supported a more circular economy. A more robust and intentional transition towards circularity offers this opportunity in some ways on steroids, right? Not only would these repair and refurbishment shops be necessary, but collection and reverse logistics, distribution centers, manufacturing capabilities, and other economic opportunities would also be required. Uh, then we can think even a little bit further back to the COVID pandemic and some other supply shocks we've had. And the circular economy offers an opportunity for local, stable supply chains. Globalized supply chains, of course, have led to increased prosperity. I think we all know that. But on the other hand, globalization of many commodity materials and key components leads to risk. Supply shocks from natural disasters, pandemics, instability due to global conflict and lack of diplomacy, and others. And developing a more localized circular economy can keep materials in use indefinitely and help avoid these supply shocks that are an unfortunate side effect of globalization. And then last, I was thinking about infrastructure and education. Green in here is my own insertion, but as AI and automation threaten jobs in both blue and white collar professions, a shift towards circularity has the potential to add fulfilling jobs to the economy. The shift towards that circularity will require new infrastructure, manufacturing plants, and people to run them. And it will require a lot of reskilling the workforce, and building a new economy presents a huge opportunity for current employees that have been hit by globalization and offshoring, but also for future generations looking for opportunities in meaningful industries. And I'll just sort of close by saying, this is a bit of a new paradigm to think about how we can align, at least in the U.S., how we can align the two sides of the political spectrum towards a shared goal. Because if we really get down to it, the environment, sustainability, climate change have all been politicized in this country to the detriment of progress. But circularity offers an on-ramp for the two sides of the political spectrum to come together to benefit the economy, human health, and the environment. And if we frame circularity as an economic and risk reduction policy rather than an environmental policy, it can be palatable to folks on both sides of the aisle. And for those of us that have been talking about the advantages of circularity for years, like myself, we have to be willing to give up the talking points in favor of success. In other words, framing the issue for both sides of the political divide does not diminish the goals we've had for it, nor does it limit the potential for positive impact. In fact, it may accelerate them because we can find new allies towards this work. And I'll end there with just this sort of high-level overview of what I was thinking when I wrote this article initially. Back to you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Jon. Again, that was Jon Smieja, who's with WAP Sustainability. Next, I'm going to like to welcome Brenda Platt, Director Compost Community Initiative, Institute for Local Self-Reliance. And Brenda, I see you're sharing your slides.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much, Brenda.
Thanks for inviting me. I just want to start off again, like Jon did, with a word about my organization, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We celebrated 50 years last year, and I've been there for almost 40 years of the ride. And we have, in the waste sector, been talking for a long time about self-reliant communities. These are just some of the many, many reports that we've worked on. This one, Salvaging the Future, came out in 1989. So this paradigm, Jon, we've been promoting for decades. But it just basically took like a hypothetical city of 1 million people, and looked at the waste that they generated and how many jobs and manufacturing could be sustained by a community of 1 million people. And it was thousands of jobs with paper mills, small metal refineries, et cetera. We've been doing a lot of work on reuse over the years, and the jobs through reuse actually dwarf recycling and remanufacturing. And then we've been doing reports on how cities can actually implement, recycling programs, businesses and households. But Dan invited me today to talk about organics and composting, and not necessarily the recycling. So I'm going to focus a little bit on that in my few minutes of remarks here. And we advocate for a kind of local, decentralized infrastructure when it comes to composting organics. And I would say the same thing is true for recycling and reuse. Like, don't put all your eggs in one basket. That is not healthy for the economy. But just to set the stage, compost is a living soil amendment. Inevitably, it ends up back in the soil. So there are connections here with farm prosperity, resilient food systems. So when we talk about building a circular economy, it transcends just recycling, right? It's really, there's so many connections to community and economic development. And when it comes to climate and getting food scraps out of landfills and incinerators. As we know, Detroit had an incinerator that was closed about 6 years ago. So it's not just landfills, but incinerators and landfills are top sources of greenhouse gases. But when you make compost and you put it in soil, it acts as a carbon sink and sequesters um, uh, carbon. So it's a win-win for the climate. And I'm just going to show a few graphics here. This is kind of this three-pronged approach that of benefits when you keep composting local. There's local social benefits, and those range from community empowerment, youth education, revitalized neighborhoods, reducing the heat island impact, things like that, and food security. There's local environmental benefits, less trash, climate resiliency, I was just talking about, healthy soils, obvious local economic impacts that extend not just to jobs, but when you have many businesses in your community doing this, you've got more business innovation. And that extends to reuse and recycling as well. You're not just relying on one company, but competition is good for innovation, right? And farmer prosperity, I want to talk about a little bit more. But I really also want to contrast this with what's happening with our waste now and big waste. And what we have now in our infrastructure, there are 4 big companies alone that dominate the $91 billion waste industry. And at each stage of waste disposal, they are profiting off of communities. They control the collection routes. 3 companies alone control about half of the US collection market for collecting waste. So they control the waste transfer stations, which means more pollution, more truck traffic, valuable community assets in the form of recycled materials, commodities are leaving communities. And at every step, these companies are profiting from the system, whether they landfill or incinerate the trash. Um, and it makes it really harder for smaller businesses to compete. So democracy is not just political, but it's also economic. And when there's too few companies in one industry after another that calls all the shots, that is not good for us economically, and it's not good for us as a democracy. And what we're seeing in not only the waste field, but in many other industries and sectors is that corporate consolidation is suppressing wages. It's breaking the supply chains and it's driving inflation. And the result of unchecked monopolies is really a more fragile economy and a less democratic society. And I just want to contrast this um, with another system that can transform a community's waste to wealth. And in these next few slides, I'm going to focus on reducing wasted food to grow community wealth. So as many of you know, about a quarter of what we throw away at the curb is made up of wasted food. And when you actually recover that material, when you reduce it, you're saving money. Each household, there was a study that came out that on average, $1,500 can be saved by the average U.S. family of 4 by not overbuying on groceries. So just doing education alone can have benefits and put dollars in people's pockets. And instead of handing money to big waste companies, you could be composting with nonprofits, with farmers, small businesses, and there's so many ways to compost. There's farm scale, there's bigger systems, there's community composters and public housing projects. This is a shot from New York City, which by the way is reducing rodent problems. And then at community gardens, schools and whatnot, so many ways to do this. And then you're using the finished compost to grow local food. Compost enhances soil fertility and soil water holding capacity, climate resiliency, and of course, healthy food production. And it creates many, many, many more jobs than landfilling or incineration. So avoiding the cost of disposal can then be reinvested to support local projects for food rescue, composting, green infrastructure. And I'll just say a word about reuse. I know JD and Cheryl, you're going to talk about recycling. I don't know how much you'll cover on reuse, but reuse is really taking off. And every business that has looking at reuse and switching to reusable, like food service products and ware, are actually saving money. We have a podcast episode. I'll put the link in the chat with the city of Austin that has a zero waste plan, and they have been investing in reuse and the circular economy for many years now. And their fix-it clinics and other different reuse and recovery programs, they have now more than $1.1 billion in total economic activity, and they've created approximately 6,300 permanent jobs in Austin. And Seattle's now looking at Reuse Seattle, and DC, Washington, DC has had funding to produce reusable food service ware. And so there's just so many opportunities to move in this direction. But I will just end with this slide that just says, if we're going to benefit from this new paradigm of a circular economy, we have to source separate. We need high quality materials. We have to be wary of contamination, and we have to really be sure we're not privileging dominant corporations or large industrial sites. All right, back to you, Dan.
Thank you so much, Brenda. I'm learning quite a bit today, and I have to apologize when my stutter is kicking in here. Our next speaker is Cheryl Coleman, Senior Vice President of the recently rebranded Recycled Materials Association.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to share a little bit about our association and about the recycled materials industry. And I am going to talk about our rebrand that we did within the last 2 years. Our industry, our members, we have 1,700 members, and our industry, we're major suppliers to manufacturing. We provide essential materials to keep the American industry running. We have a presence not only here in the United States, but we have, among our 1,700 members, we also have members in 40 countries around the globe. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we really promote safe, economically sustainable, and environmentally responsible recycling through networking, advocacy, and education. We also have a huge impact on our economy. We partner with John Dunham and Associates, and they do an economic impact study for us every year. You'll see the results. Some of them are from 2022. We're in the process of updating those specific numbers, but I really want to call your attention to the other numbers that are on this slide. In addition to what you see on this slide, we really had Dunham to dig a little deeper to find out what was our true economic impact, because we have members of our association who range from the small, I call them SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises, all the way up to our larger corporate members. And the benefits of being a part of an association enables those who do have resources that they can then share with those who may not be able to access those resources as readily, to help make them available for us to help bring along those who are in the small, commonly known as mom and pop operations, even down to the peddlers who work with our members in order to feed their families and to have income for their families. So what Dunham found was that in addition, an additional 171,000 jobs that directly support the recycled materials industry also resulted in 425,000 spillover jobs. And the reason that I put this information in here is because I worked for the federal government, and prior to that, I worked for state government for many years. Many of my colleagues are no longer working. And I'm take every opportunity to tell them that in the recycled materials industry, there is a job for everyone. So our industry ranges from folks who don't have a high school diploma, people who are coming out of incarceration, people who think differently. We have jobs for everyone, and we have training within our association to help all of those folks find jobs. So on the next slide, I pulled these numbers from USGS on yesterday. In 2025, USGS identified 60 critical minerals that are critical to our economy. And these are items that we rely on for our vehicles, electronics, clean energy, defense applications, and more. A lot of the production and the refining for these materials only happens in a few countries. And therefore, when there's any kind of disruption, whether it's logistics, weather, or even policy changes, that can create volatility for American manufacturers. So in order to meet this demand, we need strong markets. And strong markets are attained with market access. Market access is critical, both domestic as well as global markets. You see on this slide, is to really that this kind of outlines some of the critical materials that we need in this country for our everyday items. And a lot of those materials are either mined or processed in countries outside of the United States. So it's really important for us to have that market access, to be able to have some processing done outside of the US while we're building up capacity, but also to be able to have conversations and interactions. One of the things that I point to with our members as we talk about circularity and we talk about ESG, and those can be trigger words for some of our members, believe it or not. But one of the things I talk to them about is avocado toast. When I was growing up, nobody knew what avocado toast was in the small town in South Carolina that I grew up in. Now, avocado toast is on almost every menu you go to in a restaurant, you see in a restaurant. That is because someone gave someone who thought differently, someone who spoke a different language, someone who was from another country, an opportunity to share their culture and what they do. And it brought a new dimension to the American fare. That's what the recycled materials industry does. We help bring folks together, we create jobs, and we help each other. So I got a little bit off my talking points there, but I really wanted to share that because we have so many opportunities. People tell me, how are we going to get access to all of the materials that are out there? We're running shortages, we're running into trade problems, we're running into tariff problems. And I tell them that the biggest source of materials is right outside your window. It's in the room where you're sitting right now. It's on the devices that you're using in order to view this webinar. Everything that you touch in some way has been touched by the recycled materials industry. And it's up to us to make those materials accessible so that we can do all of the things that you heard our previous speakers say. There's a huge opportunity in this country, but we have to work together and we have to do it in a safe and environmentally sustainable way. Recycling is part of the answer. We strongly advocate for reuse. We also strongly advocate for repair. And we advocate for mostly recycling. We want people to have that circular mindset because recycling is only a part of the answer. We want to keep materials circulating domestically in order to support US manufacturing and to make us competitive. But we also want global access to be able to learn from each other around the world. So expanding recycling and recovery is fundamentally about economic resilience. It helps give manufacturers a more stable and predictable source of materials, and this can help reduce prices and suppress volatility. But equally important, it supports American jobs, in operations, in maintenance, in logistics, and technology. And when this is done well, it protects communities and our environment by reducing the need for extraction, lowering emissions, and improving safety around materials like batteries, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point today. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And now, wrapping up our presentations is JD Lindeberg, President, Resource Recycling Systems. JD, floor is yours. JD, you might be on mute.
Yes, I am on mute. I was
Okay.
busily thanking you, Dan and Carrie, for putting this together, and it was good to see the other folks on the panel. Especially nice to see Cheryl and Brenda again, and Jon. Nice to meet you. But more importantly, it's great to have the turnout that we've had. So I think this is a really important topic, and honestly, I'm not going to dwell on it, but I don't think it's a mystery that at the national level, our climate policy is in shambles and not where most of us would want it to be. But I do think, kind of like Jon kicked off, that the entry point and the thesis of this webinar is an important one. And honestly, for those of you, and this is a little bit of insider dope, but for those of you who are subjected to the Federalist, how waste management is Federalist by our Cheryl's former colleague Jay Bassett. I always repeat that because really it is a state responsibility, and if it's a state responsibility, it's a regional and local responsibility. So I'm going to talk a little bit about things that we've been doing that we'd like to continue here. RRS, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on who we are, headquartered in Michigan, 40 years now, makes me feel really old because I probably am. But what we're trying to do is every time we turn around, try to improve the circular economy. And one way we've been doing that I'm really excited about is harnessing innovation, harnessing new ideas, harnessing the power of smaller, primarily medium-sized organizations, whether they're for-profit, nonprofit, or in some cases, governmental. I believe very strongly in governmental entrepreneurialism, to sort of echo some of the things Brenda was talking about. And a good example of this is a program that we've had here in Michigan now for 5 or 6 years, where we bring in people with ideas and we help them flesh out those ideas. We have very few limitations to how people participate. They have to be based or aimed at Michigan because it's being funded by state funding. It needs to be an opportunity to repurpose waste as a industrial input, much like Cheryl was talking about, or engage in a prevention or reuse activity. And then in our view, and in my view in particular, it has to have a fighting chance of making the income greater than the outgo. Without that, you don't have a sustainable venture. And that's true for government, it's true for business, it's true for nonprofits as well. And we appreciate the folks who've been engaged with us. Eagle, I know there's a number of people today on the call from Eagle, Michigan Recycling Coalition, Centropolis Accelerator, Lawrence Tech, and Resource Recycling System, and all of you, including Dan, who have been really important participants in getting this off the ground. To put a important economic point on this, and to echo a number of things that have been already said, the circular economy is all around us. And yes, to some degree, big waste and big recycling dominates it, but you'd be surprised how many activities are going on in our communities at reuse, resale shops, how many activities are going on with traditional ferrous and non-ferrous scrap dealers, in the auto industry, and things like that. And the impacts of this economically, of getting to a recovery rate of approximately 45% in the state of Michigan, which, for those of you in the business know, is not a huge lift. It's a heavy lift, but it's not an impossible lift. Puts the economics associated with the circular economy at almost $34 billion. By comparison, um, tourism in the state that gets heavily advertised is only in the mid 50s. So it's a substantial fraction of something that we think about all the time, that we advertise all the time. And I'm certainly one that advocates for recognizing what an economic engine it is within the state, indeed every state, to think about the circular economy, both as it exists and how it can be improved. Final thing I'd like to leave you with is, what is the circular economy? What are the tools that we're thinking about here? And, obviously, there's residual waste coming off of all the circular economy. Zero waste is hard to achieve. But the idea is to make the red bigger than the brown, and to recognize that there's lots of points of entry into this process. And as we've already discussed, it's good for the environment. It's good for the economy. It keeps these materials and products that we spent so much money, so much energy, so much effort on making in the first place, keeps them in the system. Most importantly, it is an economic model that focuses on sustainable solutions, that brings jobs and other investment with it. And in my view, works best with regional solutions. And to sort of conclude here, we spend a lot of time. I tell the people that we're working with, and we have what feels like a stunning number of people at RRS these days, and so we constantly have new people coming in, and I tell them, listen, we're working on really hard things. If it wasn't hard, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have a consulting firm that's devoted entirely towards this effort. And as part of the hard thing, we're looking for creative solutions, sort of hacks, if you will, that say when these circumstances coincide, shortened supply chains, local sources of raw material for smaller manufacturing facilities, when those coincide in economically collaborative ways, then we could get to that goal of making these systems pencil out with greater income than expenses, which then creates sustainable jobs for people, creates sustainable endeavors, and creates resilient solutions that can withstand, as economists would say, exogenous forces like tariffs or the green fence that we all remember in the late 2000 teens, and things like that. So I'm really excited about the discussion. I'm really excited about moving to the Q&A. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, everyone. And I have just one or two questions here to get us kicked off. And I see there's already a few in the Q&A field, and we want myself, my colleague Carrie, will managing the chat as well. So over the past half hour, we talked a bit about how circular economy principles, both at scale and local communities, can promote self-reliance and prosperity, a stronger American economy, which I think everyone wants. And I have to imagine that most of the stakeholders, decision makers out there have had some exposure to sustainability, or at least recycling in general, and probably have some opinion already. Sustainability in particular, climate more so, has a reputation among many people for not being affordable, or even virtue signaling, etc. And Jon sort of introduced this already with his note about talking points. And I think that's a bit of the subtext of our talk today. How can we position these concepts to align with other priorities that may be aligned, but can sometimes just be perceived as thematically adversarial. So as a practical matter, how can people who are self-identify as sustainability advocates, and that's how they've position their careers, position their departments and their efforts, how can they start framing their arguments in language that people of different political persuasions can relate to and support? And John, I'm going to ask you to kick that off here.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we specifically think about the circular economy, one way to do that is to point to all of the examples of successful businesses out there that are operating within this circular economy, right? I know we've got some of them as attendees on the call today. There's not only recyclers, there's large repair shops, there's all these business models out there that exist that are successful in the circular economy. And if you pair that with the fact that there's over 35 million small businesses in the US, almost half the US workforce is employed in small businesses. There's a lot of opportunities in that overlap of like starting a small business that's devoted to advancing the circular economy. And I think what anybody can do is see that as an entrepreneurial opportunity, or B, if you work at a large company, really push that as a long-term strategic goal for the company. Too often what we see is large companies are willing to spend tens or hundreds of millions of dollars on new manufacturing facilities to increase capacity over time, even though the payback period on those investments is pretty long. But when it comes to circular economy initiatives, they're not willing to make that same investment. And I think if we start at the business case and say this investment in a circular economy, whether it's remanufacturing, redesign, refurbishment, will pay for itself, we can start framing it more as a long-term investment for strategic growth in companies rather than a cost of sustainability. And so I think I think in some cases, it's as simple as where you start the conversation, and starting it with an economic argument rather than an environmental or even social argument, I think is probably the way to get investment into this space. But
John, JD, Brenda, what do you, Cheryl?
Yeah, I would love to jump in here. I completely concur, John, with that. And I'll just add, I think we've already talked about this: prosperity, affordability. I think, Dan, you mentioned affordability, saving money, the economic development, the jobs, the strengthening local economies are really all important. But I think we don't need to stay away from the environmental benefits. We do. I think, John, you hit on this in your opening remarks. We need to maybe change the words that we're using so they're not, trigger words. Like if we can't say climate anymore in certain spaces, okay. But we can say healthy communities. We can say healthy soil. We can say clean air, clean water. So, and what we're talking about here is infrastructure and a circular economy that's benefiting local economies as well as environments and building healthy communities. And I think that's really important. And so we have to be able to make these connections.
Dan, I might add, first of all, I'd say what they said. I'm going to add one sort of very technical comment, which is one thing that I've been following very carefully in the news in the last 18 months is the fact that research is emerging that suggests that the standard factors for landfill methane emission have been understated somewhat dramatically. And I've been wrestling around with a variety of folks, including academics and other organizations in the business, to figure out how to actually represent that more accurately. Because if they are in fact what it appears to be from some of the research that was done by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory of flying drones over and looking at the methane emissions, landfill emissions go from being sort of the third most important methane emission coming out of the US to tied for first with enteric digestion from the cattle industry, with cow farts, and oil and gas fugitive emissions. And if that's really the case, there's really some significant opportunity for cashing in on the systems that we already have for avoided carbon emissions, which are still in place and are still available, even though not on a national basis. So I think there's some technical stuff that needs to be done here that really help this equation out.
So I'm going to take a little bit different approach. I believe in meeting people where they are, that we start conversations by meeting people at the point of where they are at that moment. When I came to what is now called REMA, I came here to do sustainability. And I met with a lot of resistance from a lot of our members. And it didn't matter whether they were a small mom or pop or whether they had 5,000 staff. There was resistance until I started talking about the benefits that come not from looking at the terms E, S, and G, but looking at why those applications help grow your business and help you keep a healthy business. We all know that when we operate safely, we protect our workers and we protect the communities around us. And so we approach a lot of sustainability from a safety perspective because that resonates with our members. When we talk about environmental compliance, we talk about what can happen if you're not environmentally compliant. That putting things off by not operating safely not only jeopardizes the health of your employees, it also jeopardizes the health of your business. Many of our members, their businesses are named after them. It is their business. So if I say I'm at Lindeberg or Lindeberg Industries, or I'm at Coleman Company, and you walk on my site and you see a site that you just want to turn around and leave, what does that say about me as a person? So I believe in meeting people where they are, and our association was called the Institute for Scrap Recycling Industries. When we did a poll and we asked people what scrap meant to them, we got everything from murderers to drug dealers to smugglers. We got all to people who had operations behind fences with dogs that would attack you if you came anywhere near it. And so we had to do a lot of cleaning up of our image and really helping people to know who we were and who we are and the benefits we bring to our community. So I love opportunities like this to talk about our industry because it helps people, it starts that conversation. And I will tell you, we did a poll on what ESG means. 71% of the people polled thought it was eggs, sausage, and grits. Now, there are some people in the country who don't even know what grits are, but that was an opinion that was out there. So I think we have to meet people where they are, find out what's important to them, and then talk about these issues from that standpoint and how it can help them in their lives and their families.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Well said, everyone. So the first thing I'm going to pull out of the chat and Q&A here, and I think this may be a bit counterintuitive to the discussion that we're having today, but I found, and I think the question references this, that a number of the members that we work with, especially those with multinational footprints, they're reacting more to standards that are coming out of international markets, especially Europe, than they are to things that are happening here. So I guess to start that up, I want to ask the question two ways in case you're less prepared to talk about the EU Green Deal and similar things. What can our country learn from other countries about establishing self-reliance and or the type of policies that they're moving forward? If you want to maybe bring extended producer responsibility in there, I know that's not quite the same thing. Feel free to do so. And JD, you're already unmuted, so thought maybe I'll start with you on this if you feel ready to comment.
Well, I think the EPR experiment that we're experiencing in half a dozen states these days is going to really give us greater understanding of whether those policy level, how effective those policy levels can be. Like a lot of new applications of policy, there's a degree of chaos that's sort of sorting itself out at the moment. But the underlying impact of this is going to be the injection of hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars into the recovery industry in ways that investment has not happened in the past. It's going to support existing recovery activities. It's going to motivate new recovery. It's going to expand additional markets, and make some of those moves. And I think it's really sort of an exciting time to be watching that. A number of us have our breath held because there's some ways that which this could go off the rails. Personally, I'm a fan of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, because in this case, the good is quite good. And so I'm a little frustrated at times with sort of the, kind of let's adhere to some really let's not meet people where they are, to echo Cheryl's comments. I think in this instance, it's pretty important to meet people where they are, meet companies where they are, meet consumers where they are, but recognize that there's going to be some really nice support for infrastructure development.
Thank you. Jon, you want to comment a bit on European policy?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this quite a bit in my new role as we look at specifically extended producer responsibility in Europe. I think there's a couple lessons we can learn from it here in North America. One, it actually does work quite well to increase the amount of a material that's collected, sorted, and properly handled. The biggest issue, and I think one thing that we can learn and hopefully learn from, not to replicate, is that the end markets are still a problem there, right? The recycling industry in Europe is still not thriving, even though they've got more input. There's been some recent articles out about the collapse of the recycling industry in Europe. So I think what we need to do, I have a newsletter on LinkedIn that I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. I think what we need to do is really focus on those end markets, right? How do we build reliable end markets for this material so there is a business imperative to collect and properly recycle materials, right? That's especially true in plastics, glass, pulp and paper, maybe less so in steel and aluminum, where there are known end markets for the materials. But the other thing I think we can look to Europe for is the new Eco Design for Sustainable Product Regulation, ESPR. That could have huge impacts on our ability to transition from our current very linear economy to circularity, with new requirements around the information that comes along with a product so that you actually know what to do with it at the end of life, the way that products are designed for longevity or refurbishment, repair. I think there's a lot of big opportunity in that space. And while we might not have any sightline to anything like that nationally here in the US, that could be something to watch out for the larger states in the future to start actually implementing policies around product design instead of just product end of life. So I think that's where the biggest opportunities really are, right? Is how do we change the way products are designed and manufactured to make them fit better into a circular economy.
You also were thinking things about India's self-reliance.
Yeah, self-reliance got brought up. I got a chance to visit India a few years ago, and visit some places where they were handling waste, and the self-reliance issue is really important there. In a very critical way. They bring in a lot of materials that they don't have a good way to handle at the end of life. From other parts of the world, right? Think of these little shampoo sachet, like flexible materials, a lot of the plastics that they don't really have the infrastructure to either collect or recycle. And they have just been incredibly creative in a lot of senses about how to manage these materials at the end of life. Granted, it's a little bit different paradigm because a lot of the work that's being done to manage those materials is on the backs of people who have very poor working conditions and don't make enough money. But they've really started to build systems in India to try to address these problems that more or less have been foisted upon them by the global north, that they're sort of trying to work through in real time. And I think it's just a really good example of how much more motivated you can be to deal with waste issues when they're in your face. Right here in North America, our waste issues aren't in our faces. Somebody comes and picks our stuff up and we never see it again. There they have to deal with it person by person, and therefore they're getting creative about how to handle those issues. So I think we can learn a lot by the way about how to manage waste based on what some of these communities in the global south are doing out of necessity. So yeah, that's all I was thinking there.
Yeah, and John, I completely concur that we have so much to learn from the global south. And just a word on plastics that I'll just say. I mean, we talked about reuse, and there's so much unnecessary plastic and plastic packaging, and we hear about plastic circularity, but plastics are so hard to be made circular once they're downcycled instead of reused. So that's just something to note. But back to European policy, I just wanted to make a few points a little bit maybe that haven't been made before. One is the EU kind of went to the lowest common denominator often on the country policies. Like Denmark used to have a much stronger reuse policy. They didn't even have aluminum cans because they couldn't be reused. And so JD, I think you made the point earlier, like in the US, we have strong states and there's ability to have strong state policy. So we don't necessarily want federal policies that are the lowest common denominator. We want states to be leading. Europe, I think, are still some good models on getting toxics out of products, requiring that organics be banned from landfill disposal. So there's some things to look toward. And then on the monopoly point I made earlier, Europe is much better on breaking up monopolies and enforcing antitrust regulations. So just some thoughts there. Back to you, Dan.
Cheryl, did you have a last word on that before we move on here?
In the interest of time, I want, because there's so much I could say, so in the interest of time, I'm going to defer.
Well, and that brings us to our last question today, and I'm going to build off a question from Professor Jim Anhunt here. So, after the better part of a year of America First trade policy, federally, and I think we've been seeing this start to emerge in the states and local communities as well. How are these ideas shaping out? And also don't feel obligated to name names if none come to mind, but if there are particular actors or agencies or policies you would like to elevate, please take your opportunity to do so. And we'll be wrapping up with these last thoughts. And Cheryl, why don't you kick that off and start bringing us home here?
I think it's too early to tell, and with the recent disruptions, I don't feel comfortable opining on that right now. I worked in federal government, and so I've heard some internal things and I think it's too early to tell.
Yeah, you bet. And I think we're certainly doing great things among the REMA members, though. GD?
Well, I'll just go back to the theme of the states, and we've been through various cycles, none quite as extreme as this, of pullback in my lifetime, which is obviously a long time, of pullback from the focus on environment at the federal level. And I've found that there is then a filling of the space that happens at state government, obviously not all states. There's a filling of the state, there's a filling of the space that happens with some of the big NGOs. Bloomberg, for instance, continuing to fund international climate stuff going on. And so there's sort of a push and shove, and obviously it takes a while for things to catch up. Maybe they don't catch up. Maybe it's not the same. But to me, there's a pendulum that has swung back and forth and continues to swing, and I would expect that to continue. And I believe that's the case for both circular economy and sort of sustainability writ large.
Thank you, Brenda, and then I think we'll give Jon the last word here today.
All right, so I'll just make a point to back to kind of more the organics and the farmer prosperity here. That I think one thread that we could be, nationally and in our states is really pulling on is, if we're actually composting more and building healthy soils through compost, then we're importing less synthetic fertilizers, and we could be transforming our American farm and food systems to be more resilient because of all the benefits that composting provides that synthetic fertilizers don't. And most synthetic fertilizers are imported in this country. And this could be, expanded to food scraps as animal feed supplements. We actually import a lot of the supplying grains for that. And so the tariffs kind of play into that. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to build more farmer prosperity through kind of homegrown American economy here.
Nice. Totally agree. I'll keep this very short because I know we're at time. I don't think we've seen as much of the America First push in the first year of the Trump administration as we may have expected from the campaign. There's been a lot of other stuff going on. The tariffs are clearly an exception of that, or exception to that. And I think progress or change in this space takes time. We've got three years left of this current administration. And I think we still have an impetus to continue to make the argument that the circular economy is the way forward in these next 3 years, and try to continue to push for advancement here. So again, a lot of this is still up in the air. A lot of work to do.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jon. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, JD. And thank you, Brenda. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This webinar will be on demand for a few weeks and move to YouTube. And keep an eye out for a follow-up email that will include information and direction to everyone's websites, podcasts, and newsletters, etc. Again, thank you, everyone, for being here. And this was I think, a wonderfully interesting conversation today. I'm very grateful for your time.
Dan.
Good to see y'all. Thanks, Dan.